assistant dean of the Calderwood School, which is basically the humanities side at Grove City College. She's also a professor of social work, and she has just published a textbook on faith, social work from a faith perspective, something like that, right? But she also is someone who you can always tap into if there are needs that you have that perhaps require a professional consultant, as it were. And so as we offered to you last year, if you would like to just meet with her, visit with her, talk, there's a variety of different ways in which Lisa can sort of enter into your world. Please contact us or contact Lisa directly. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to highlight this video, but also introduce her. She's going to talk to us about, well, I'll let you introduce your topic.
Okay.
But without further ado, this is Dr. Lisa Hosack.
Can we push this up just a little bit?
Sure. Push it what up?
Yeah, just a little
Further out. I'm not, this is for me. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. Do you want a clicker?
No, that's okay. I'm good, yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the PRM team for asking me to be here, which is a great honor to be with you. So thank you so much. I know these events are special because I've kind of hung around here before, so I'm going to stay around for dinner just because it's fun. So maybe you remember, well, actually, I think the talk is, the name of the talk is Grit and Grace, Resilience in a Post-COVID World. I'm not going to talk about the COVID too much because I've had enough COVID myself, but I'm going to focus more on resilience and grit today and come at it maybe from a little bit different vantage point. Can you hear me, Dr. Kevin? Yeah, we're good, okay. So maybe you remember as a child, like I do, being in school and hearing a teacher introduce onomatopoeia. Remember that, onomatopoeia? I had to look it up for my notes. I had no idea how to spell that. But that's, of course, where the word sounds like the thing it's trying to describe. So it's boing, boing, gargle, although I think that's a little weaker, and pitter patter, those kinds of words. So this summer, I had the really wonderful opportunity to be in South Africa for 2 weeks, totally vacation, not working, so that's even more wonderful. But while we were there, we had the opportunity to go on a safari, my sister and I. We were, of course, we're both, as animal people, we were pretty enthralled with all the animals. And I won't get started on the people around here are tired of hearing these stories, so I'm just going to go forward. But one of the things that we found absolutely remarkable was also the birds. So in Kruger National Park, where we were on safari, there are apparently over 500 different species of birds. And I'm not a bird person, but if you are, you should definitely go and take one of those giant cameras. But at any rate, one day we were out on safari, and we heard this very distinctive bird call. And it caught all of our attention because it was so loud and it was almost really creepy looking. So I'm not going to tell you the name of this bird, onomatopoeia though. And I'm going to, I have a recording of this, but mine isn't as good as this one. It has South African people talking over it. So I want you to hear this bird call. Oops. Is that going to work, you guys? Oh dear. Try it again. I think so, but maybe you guys. I can't go forward without this. This is very important. Yeah.
It's probably under your settings.
Yeah. Okay, well, I got to get in the mood. Go away! Go away! That's what it sounds like. Let me try it again. That first one was really too guttural for the way this bird was. Go away! Go away! Go away! Wow, should have practiced that. Anyway, that is what the bird sounds like. I wanted you to hear it in person, or in a real thing, but that is okay. So the actual sound of the bird sounds like go away, and so they've titled the bird Go Away. And actually what's interesting about this bird is that it literally serves sort of a purpose of warning other animals, smaller animals in the environment about a predator nearby. So when we were on safari and we heard the go away bird, our guide said, there's probably a leopard or a lion nearby, which is like, ooh, okay. But anyway, so I thought after I saw the go away bird and experienced it, wouldn't it be helpful to have a go away bird flying above each of us, giving shrill warnings about peril and predators in our own environments, sounding the alarm about dangers that he could see but we can't. And so maybe to bring that idea closer to home, maybe you as pastors would like to harness the message of the go away bird when the perils of ministry surround you. When you experience internal doubts about your effectiveness or competency. When you experience the frustration of trying to lead your congregation toward deeper discipleship and you're seeing only status quo living. Or when you experience numerous deaths in rapid succession that threaten to overwhelm you and to overwhelm your church. Without a doubt, every one of us could fill in the blank with specific things in our lives, or maybe even people in our lives, but that's another topic, that we would like to screech, go away to. Of course, it doesn't really work that way, though. And you know, as do I, from working closely with people, that both we and those we minister to often have to adapt to things that will not go away. Instead, it's often us who must change, altering our posture, directing others to, or challenging them, encouraging them to adapt their posture, and perhaps learning to relate differently to intractable scenarios in our lives or in theirs. So I was asked by the PRM team, as I said, to talk about emotional resiliency or grit, and which I understand is sort of the overarching theme of today and also tomorrow, which I think is terrific, by the way. But for our purposes in these few minutes, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. So resilience and grit, if the experts were here, they would revolt at this time and tell me to go away. But though for our purposes, we're just going to say they mean something similar. And a whole lot of ink has been spilled on trying to define what are the specific marks or the specific tenets of both resiliency and grit. And this is in a way sort of understandable, perhaps to you folks in working directly with people. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in it because frankly, there are a lot of things in people's lives, as I said, that they can't simply say go away to, but they must somehow adapt themselves to. Angela Duckworth is the name most associated with research, particularly in the construct of grit. And you may have heard of her. She's a teacher. She taught in high school. And so God bless all high school and middle school teachers. She noticed in the course of her teaching as a young teacher that some of the students had a tendency to excel academically and socially, and some of the students did not. And she noticed that that seemed to be entirely, in some cases, independent of their intelligence. That wasn't a mark by which you could explain the difference in success rates at least academically, between those different types of students. And so she became very intrigued by this and gave up high school teaching and became a psychological researcher who in 2013 gave a talk on grit, a TED talk, I should say, which was, to date, I just checked, it's been viewed 28 million times. And she wrote a book on the same subject, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 6 months after its publication. There's a lot of interest in this idea. What makes people stick with things? What creates resiliency? And perhaps particularly as it pertains to children, but that concept has been widely expanded. So I want to share with you, oh dear, that went up again. I want to share with you a couple of things that have been denoted in the literature scientifically about resilience and grit. First of all, to draw your attention to the left side of this slide, which indicates a very kind of a definition that I think we can grab onto: holding to a core purpose despite setbacks. I like the definition, holding to a core purpose despite setbacks. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Kind of keep that definition in your head. These are some of the tenets that have been shown, so some of the things we can learn about those constructs. First of all, and perhaps maybe most importantly, resilience and grit are changeable. They are not fixed in time. In other words, they can grow, they can increase. They don't have to be stagnant. And to me, that sort of relates to the second point which is that both of those constructs are learned and not necessarily inherited. By inherited, we mean they're not genetically based, that you're either born resilient and gritty or you're not. I find that incredibly encouraging, that there aren't this idea of holding to a core purpose despite setbacks is not something that certain people is off limits to certain people. As I mentioned earlier from the work of Angela Duckworth, it's not related to intelligence. Thanks be to God for that. It's not related to intelligence. And then a few other things. It manages the fear of failure. So if you're going to become resilient and gritty, you have to manage those fears that may be I think are quite common to the human experience of what happens if I fail, what happens if we fail, et cetera. Whatever constellation that takes in your life or your context. It seeks excellence and not perfection, something we're really working on with our students who tend to be a bit on the perfectionistic side around here. No doubt the professors are too. So seeking excellence versus perfection, allowing disappointment, sort of along the lines with the fear of failure, and celebrating progress. And that could be incremental progress too, by the way, not just the achieving of big goals. So those are some of the tenets of that I hope sort of are in the background guiding our discussion. I want to also share so what happens in the helping professions is social sciences. Somebody identifies a construct and then lots of people try to develop instruments to measure that. And so there are lots of resilience and grit tests out there. And I just pulled a few questions. This is not a whole test here. It's longer than this. But this is from also the work of Angela Duckworth. And so she gives this test to people. She's given it to all kinds of different populations. And these are some of the questions she uses to measure this construct. I've overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge. Setbacks don't discourage me. I'm a hard worker and I finish what I begin. I don't know about you, but I read these things and I say, well, those are good qualities. Those are very good qualities, that people work hard. I grew up on a farm, so that's like the most important thing ever. You be a hard worker. So finish what you start. Don't just keep going, etc. Overcome setbacks. Those are good things. But also, as I look at a test like this, it also seems like the construct of grit is a synonym of sorts, at least as it's used here, for being highly self-disciplined, for being kind of tenacious, what we might call stick-to-itiveness. Those are good things. All of those are good things. But it also strikes me that if we were to write a grit test for people of faith, for Christians, it might assume a different set of premises or presuppositions, and therefore it might look a little bit different. Now, maybe that's been done. I didn't research it before this talk, but I suspect it would look different. And then finally, if we developed a grit test for rural pastors, and that maybe that's been done too, I'm not sure, but it would look slightly different yet. So what are the things that allow you, assist you, help you in holding to your core purpose despite setbacks? So drawing on that definition that I just shared, we want to consider what traits, what practices, especially that one, what practices would help pastors to maintain their core purpose in spite of setbacks. Now, I don't know your specific core purpose, so I can't fill that in here, but I'm taking a pretty good leap, pretty solid leap, and saying that we are all called to a core purpose, called to focus our energies on loving God and loving one another. So we could ask more specifically, if we inserted those core purposes, what traits, what practices would help pastors to hold on to their love of God and their love of others despite setbacks? So I just want to bookend that a second and take a little bit of a detour. I would suggest that an important starting point in this conversation, although we could go lots of directions, I think, is revisiting biblical truths about our humanness. What theologian and writer and my friend Kelly Kapic, who teaches at Covenant College, refers to as our creaturely finitude. So I'm going to use that phrase quite a bit, creaturely finitude. What in the world does that mean? What does he mean? What do we mean by creaturely finitude? I think it means a lot of things. But creaturely finitude means remembering, not just intellectually, not just cognitively, but in one's regular life and practices, that we are created with limits. And that humans with inherent limits were part of the creation that God looked upon and called good, that he called very good, in fact. Our limitations, our boundaries, our finitude, therefore, those are not deficiencies to be overcome, but rather realities to be embraced. And that's a thesis of a lot of Kapic's work. So to live in light of our human limitations and dependency, it seems, is to live wisely. And I've been reading in the biblical wisdom literature. Biblical wisdom literature, as you know, is clear that at least part of wisdom, or wisdom, is the byproduct of a fear of God. And the fear of God, I'm among people who are theology experts here, so I'm not going to go too far there. But the fear of God, as I understand it, is partly about holding to an accurate sense of who we are and who God is. So fearing God, relating to God accurately or with a right sense of his size and our size. This is what Kapic refers to as a strong theology of creation. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about how a strong theology, or maybe a stronger theology of creation, relates to resiliency and relates to grit. I don't think that practicing a strong theology of creation is necessarily easy. In fact, I'm going to go on a limb and say it's not easy. I don't think it's intuitive either. Perhaps there are ways that you affirm your limitations and your dependency as a human intellectually, theologically, but not necessarily pastorally, and by that I mean not in the practices of your life. I can only imagine that one of the challenges of pastoring is trying to translate theological truths to right living and to make the bridge between extrapolating theology and encouraging people to live according to those beliefs. None of us are immune from holding on to beliefs that don't match our actions, and at least in parts, and certainly our fallenness is related to that. To take this idea further, in his book, You're Only Human, How Your Limits Reflect God's Design and Why That's Good News, which I love that book title, Capek suggests that as Christians, we even at times confuse our creaturely limitations, our creaturely finitude with sin. What does he mean by this? That's a bold statement, maybe. I quote here, "Finitude is an unavoidable aspect of our creaturely existence. We are limited by space, time, power, knowledge, energy, and perspective." I'm saying amen to that. The older I get, the energy part, I want to emphasize that. Often when we rush to meet all the expectations that surround us, we subtly desire to become infinite in capacity. Catch that, that's important. Sometimes lurking under our desires to expand our abilities is the unspoken temptation, if only I were the infinite creator, not a finite creature. In fact, he says, from the time of the fall in the garden, we all live in a disordered relationship to our limits. With indirect tactics, the serpent encourages us to imagine that we should know more, we should be more, we should do more. He suggests that our divinely given limits are faults to be overcome rather than beneficial gifts to be honored. So if we each had our own go-away bird flying above us, I suspect that bird would go ballistic if when the temptation to act like our creator and not as the created comes near to us or enters into our lives. It's an effective tactic of the evil one to convince God's beloved that they're actually the ones who are in control, who are responsible for what happens and what the outcomes are. It's an effective tactic because such a disordered relationship with our finitude leads us down dangerous paths, as you might be able to surmise what some of those paths are. For example, when we run into our limits, which is inevitable, we can hang on to the delusion that by just working harder, we might regain control. We will regain control. By digging in deeper, we will change the outcome. And that's a recipe, unfortunately, not for resilience or grit, but for burnout, apathy, which relates to burnout, and perhaps worse of all, paralysis. It's no secret that unrealistic expectations of ourselves can produce disillusionment and burnout. And in fact, this is from Capek's work, he defines self-care in a theological sense as maintaining a healthy appreciation of our creaturely finitude. I just find that to be so helpful. Describing self-care in a theological sense as maintaining a healthy appreciation of our creaturely finitude. Now, I would just want to make a quick caveat here. We are called, all of us, universally, to love God and neighbor, and our neighbor. And God, in his mercy, is not going to call us to something that is beyond our limits, that is beyond our creaturely finitude. So, in other words, we could safely, logically assume that loving God and neighbor is within the possibility, the range of our creaturely finitude, which is absolutely enormously good news. Yes, we will love God and others imperfectly, all the time imperfectly, but thanks be to God that he has provided core purposes, called us to core purposes that do not fall outside of our creaturely finitude. Come what may, remaining faithful to the love of God and neighbor is not only central to our calling, but possible within our creaturely finitude and, of course, within our fallen nature. So what's the good news, and how could holding tightly to your creaturely finitude increase your resilience as a pastor? I just want to make a few comments and then provide a couple of practical suggestions, because I think we have to be practical here in trying to bridge that gap between something theological, something that's not intuitive for us, and a way that we're trying to increasingly live into. So consider this question. Do you experience consistent feelings of guilt, maybe low-level guilt, about how little you accomplish each day? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but just answer in your head. I'm raising my hand here. A nagging guilt that you're not doing enough, or even anxiety, maybe low-level anxiety itself, can be a warning sign that we have a misaligned view of our finitude. Now, I'm not suggesting that all anxiety relates to that. I'm aware that it can relate to lots of things. But I think it's interesting to think about those emotions as warning signs that something is misaligned, perhaps. We do not accurately remember our creaturely finitude when, for example, we experience a sense of failure, shame, or even like we are letting God down when our ministry outcomes are poor. Related to this, we do not accurately remember our creaturely finitude when we overestimate expectations for an individual person, meaning ourselves, including ourselves, forgetting that it takes the whole body of Christ to accomplish his purposes. That it takes disciples, both locally and globally, jointly serving as Christ's hands and feet. So a question to ask ourselves is, how might my relationship to God and others be different if I thanked God for my limitations versus trying to ignore or even overcome them? Another caveat, it's worth, you might be thinking, I don't know what you're thinking, but you might be thinking, yeah, but what about those times when I have 3 funerals in a week, or some other period of accelerated stress or necessary activity? And that is not lying. You can't say go away to it. You have to deal with it. And we all have periods like that when we are stretched. We have seasons sometimes in life when we are stretched. But even those times can't be sustained indefinitely without physical or emotional, possibly even spiritual damage. A reality which I think only serves to underscore the truth about our finitude, the truth about our limits. So a couple of suggestions to practically think about better embracing our creaturely finitude. Acceptance, as I said earlier, suggested earlier, I don't think comes naturally for us as fallen people. And embracing this truth is, of course, not a one-time event. It's not at least not usually, the way it works, but rather a truth, a freedom that has to be habituated through regular and repetitive practices. Justin Whitmer Early, in his book, the common rule, connects some of our poor habits to underlying what he calls liturgies of wrong belief. And he gives many of them. I just give a couple examples here of how sometimes our actions reflect what he refers to as underlying wrong beliefs. So, for example, not getting enough sleep or exercise on a regular basis or in a patterned way belies the belief my body will be fine without those things. Reading work emails before getting out of bed. He suggests sometimes there's a belief under there, a wrong belief. I need to respond immediately to work concerns, etc. And then saying yes to every invitation that comes along, that he suggests perhaps there's a wrong belief under that. I don't want to disappoint or look bad in anyone's eyes. And perhaps we could think of many, many other ways in which there's a mismatch there between those things. Early in his book, The Common Rule, again, suggests that he centers, the book is, well, let me back up and say that the book is about some practical ways of living, some rules that he has applied to his life and that assist him in many things, among them adopting a stronger and deeper sense of his finitude. And he divides those into two ways, love of God and love of neighbor. So he says that, among others, I just pulled a few here as examples, that practical practices, what he calls his common rule, what I'm calling gritty practices for holding on to a love of God despite setbacks, are things such as these. These are examples. Kneeling prayer, he makes a specific point about kneeling, and that's not possible, obviously, in every situation, but he likes the aspect of the embodied nature of that it involves one's body. So kneeling prayer 3 times a day. Sabbath 1 day a week, as we're familiar. Scripture reading daily, and I just put in there, not for the sermon, for you. And then he divides that into gritty practices for loving your neighbor, for holding to love of neighbor despite setbacks, whatever those look like. I really like these. Eating a meal with another person every day. I mean, that could be your spouse or your children, but eating a meal with someone, a human, every day. Conversation with a friend 1 hour per week. And you probably get the gist there. He means real conversation with somebody who's listening, and it's a reciprocal relationship. And then a big topic that is important and so important, curating one's use of media. I'm sure that many of you are working with your congregations to be more thoughtful about this because it's such a challenge. But having 1 phone-free hour per day where the phone is turned off or out of reach or what have you. Curating media, there's a lot more, of course, we could say about that. But I find these sort of helpful rules to think about, rules that might help us to remember our limitations and thereby help us to become more resilient, more gritty in the things that we are called to do, love of God and love of neighbor. On that last point, I did want to say that here at Grove City, we've had, you may be familiar with Andy Crouch, has been on our campus talking about practices related to media. And much of what he says resonates with me, but in one conversation he talked about, in relating to media, what he calls liturgies of resistance. And one of those is that he has many, but one of those is that he steps outside every morning. One of the first things he does, and most definitely before checking the phone, he steps out of the door of his home to remind himself of his place in creation, to remind himself that he is of his creatureliness. And such a simple practice, except when it's January, but such a simple practice, but yet something that can be helpful. So I tried to imagine a grit test for Christians. I took a stab at that. Here's a stab, and it's just a stab. So if we took a test, grit test, take two, and we altered that for people of faith, maybe it would constitute these things. I remind myself daily of who I am and who God is. More than daily, actually. I pray and strive for healthy expectations of myself and others. I work hard, but I also honor the Sabbath and practice self-care as we defined it, and as it's defined perhaps in other ways as well. I strive to be faithful, leaving outcomes in God's hands. There is a subtle but very real pressure which originated in the garden and continues in our contemporary world, perhaps in its own poignant ways, to form ourselves into God. This belief can seep into our practices, our daily living, leading us to take more responsibility than we should, to feel guilty about things we don't have the ability to do or the ability to control, and even in our hubris, to ignore our physical and emotional selves. I want to suggest that resiliency or grit is not about, or at least it's not at the heart, I don't think, about reaching within yourself to drum up superhuman self-discipline. Thanks be to God for that. But that it's built through daily habits that repeatedly remind you to honor your creaturely finitude, to fear God, and not to attempt to act outside or defy your God-given limitations, but rather to honor them. I think that practicing creaturely finitude is extraordinarily important to resilience, because resilience is so tied to knowing our role and knowing God's role, at least resilience as a person, as a Christian. It's about staying in our lane. My husband says that a lot, and I was like, that really applies here. Staying in our lane. God, in his grace, knows our limitations, and like Leonard Cohen wrote so many years ago, he uses our cracks to let his light shine in. I made that Christian, but his light versus the light, but you get the point. So in conclusion, what if we were to screech, "Go away," to the ways we attempt to be superhuman, and to listen instead to the voice of the Spirit calling us to the lighter burden, the sweet and liberating rhythms of grace? Thank you so much.
We have a few, are you okay?
Yeah.
I want to ask you a few questions. Does anyone want to interact, respond with Dr. Hosack?
We're going to get the audio going before we leave this place, so yeah.
First of all, I appreciate the idea of Sabbath. It's something that God convicted me on, and I found I was actually more productive throughout my week. I have in that time. I'm curious. I work at bivocational, and I work in a public school. I see a lot of posters, you can do it, nothing's impossible for you, and they bother me because like I can't be an NBA basketball player, me personally, for lots of reasons. But are we setting up people for a failure for something that's beyond them? I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to encourage the students not to quit, and I appreciate that. But is it true?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think a product of a modernist culture which calls people to this sort of this idea that you have to create yourself, you have to create your own identity, and part of doing that is we see. I'll say that I see this in our students a lot. They feel a strong need to define who they are. And that relates to creaturely finitude too. It's recognizing that actually you don't have to do that. And there's a tremendous burden lifted in not having to do that. But I think, yeah, we see sort of these, we get the motive behind it, but it is a dangerous message, and frankly, it's a false message. Yeah. So anyone else want to comment on that?
And you're right, that's not how we should be engaged.
Does anyone have any feedback for, particularly if you're serving alone and asked to do many things that would not be in your gifting, or how, does anyone have thoughts about managing that?
I think there's always a balance between using it as an excuse, I'm not gifted at this, I can't do this, and saying I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And on the other hand, going back to saying I'm only human, and just trying to wrestle that out sometimes. Hard to discern.
I liken that to our roles as a parent, where you want to encourage your children to do their best, but at the same time not put so much pressure on them that you're going to destroy their happiness. I mean, it's just finding that right balance.
Yes, right. Yep. Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I just think with that, one of the things too is just two actions can carry two different responses within our soul based upon the motivating disposition that is behind the action. And so when you're talking, I love everything that you were saying, and just with that idea of creature finitude is also having a good anthropology and knowing the nature of the creature. And thinking of St. Aquinas and his discussion on the virtue of humility, which is the right assessment of the self, or viewing oneself through the eyes of God. And so recognizing that humility, I think in our culture, is doing things for the sake of faithfulness, but recognizing our God is not Pharaoh. So our value is not rooted in how productive we are. So we're not valuable because we're productive, we're valuable because we're beloved. And so then having that right disposition, you can step in and do what needs to be done for the sake of ministry, and it can be life-giving even if you suck at it, as opposed to going into and killing yourself, doing what you're really good at, but then dying on the inside because it's born out of a sense of needing to prove one's worth because of your productivity.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Since you're thinking version 1 and version 2 of the tests that you referred to, now version 1 ends with the conclusion of making much of what you've done. And version 2 that has a sense of creature infinitude. Just the opposite of that. It's staying in our lane and place that God is God, and we're dependent and grateful, and joyfully participating in what He would do beyond our ability to do anything. Beauty in that comes. It makes much of Jesus in version 2, and it makes much of us in version 1. And at the end of the day, I'm thinking of these students you referred to that want to make their mark and have their place. Who cares? At the end of the day, that anyone knows their name, or yours on them. We'll know the name of everyone, of many who passed test 1. We may not know the name of anyone who passes test 2. Expect the people that passed test 2 have made much of the name that matters.
I can't finish that. That was at the end. So yeah. I just want to show you. I brought the books